A reading from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 25. When the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, he will sit on his glorious throne. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate the people one from another, as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. He will put the sheep on his right and the goats on his left. Then the king will say to those on his right, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father, take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me." Then the righteous will answer him, "Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you a stranger and invite you in, or needing clothes and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and go to visit you?" The king will reply, "Truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me."
Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to Community Christian. If you haven't met me yet, or you met me and don't remember my name, which is okay, I'm Ed, and I'm one of the pastors here at Community Christian. We are honored that you took time this morning to come and be with us. I'm going to start today by asking you a question, but before I get to the question, a little background, and because I think the question's simple, you're going to get the answer right off. The last few weeks, we've been talking about this idea of being the followers of Jesus and practicing the way. You can see that on the scripture. And I know the other two guys who've taught so far in this series have already told you this, but I just want to remind you in case you didn't know. Followers of Jesus weren't called Christians to begin with. In fact, what they were called were followers of the way. And the reason for that is because there was a way that they did life. There was a pattern to how they did life. And they did life in the way of Jesus. In fact, just historically speaking, the word Christian didn't come to existence, most historians believe, for the first 15 to 20 years of the movement of Jesus, which, by the way, the movement of Jesus wasn't started when Jesus was on the planet. It started after he had left the planet, after his resurrection. He had said to his followers, "Hey, you go into all the world, teach everybody everything that I've commanded you to do, and baptize them." Then the movement got moving. And about 15 years into that movement, somebody began to call them Christians in a city where they had grown. And largely, the word Christian was intended to be a word of derision. They intended it to be something to cast off on them. It's a word that means little Messiah, and they thought they would take it as a bad thing. "We're calling you little Messiahs." But instead, the practitioners of the way said, "We like that. We like the fact that you're calling us little Messiahs because we're trying to live in the way of the Messiah. We're trying to follow him." And then the name Christian sort of became the thing for this whole movement. They took this form of living their life in the way of Jesus, and they moved forward with it. And you just know, we've said this in this series, the reason we're focusing on the way is that for the first several hundred years, they weren't really that interested in what people believed. There were beliefs that mattered. I'm not trying to say there weren't. There were key beliefs. In fact, if you weren't here, we did a whole series on some key beliefs that were core to the movement of Jesus from the very beginning. But in the beginning, what they really focused is on, are you willing to live the way? Are you willing to live in the way? And the correction they gave to people was in people that were not living according to the way. And so as they began to move, this became the thing. So we've been talking about this for a few weeks now, and I'll catch you up real quick. The first week we talked about worship, which is when we come together, which you've just done, and we lift up the name of Jesus on the very first day of the week. And the reason we do it on the first day of the week is because that's the day that Jesus resurrected from the dead. In honor of him, we come on the first day of the week and we say, "Lord, you're first in my life. Before anything else happens this week, before I get off track with anything else, the very first thing I do on the first day of the week is I give my worship to you to remind myself that you are first, and I give you the worship that you deserve." And then we talked about, Jason taught us about prayer. That prayer isn't me coming to God and just saying, God, help me, be with me, all the things that all of us say, because God's already agreed to be with us the whole time and help us. He's actively doing those things. Prayer is where I enter into communication with God, and in my spirit, I begin to tell him how I'm feeling about the day, and I begin to move toward him in direct communication, and we develop a relationship. And then last week, Nathan taught us about the one another's, that we serve one another and love one another and bear with one another. And at the end of that, here's the key phrase I'd want you to remember. The way that you know that you love God is how you love the person sitting next to you. Your love for God will never exceed your love for the people that are around you. In fact, God makes really clear that you know that a person loves God by the way they love their brothers and sisters. And that brings us to this week and to my question, which we'll kick off with. I'll ask you this. Who's the most compassionate person who ever lived? Okay, so now since you're having a little trouble with this, let me prompt you a little bit on this one. Imagine that you were sitting in a room where a person just told you they came together to worship Jesus, and that Jason had told you we're followers of Jesus, and that we come together today and we're going to learn about the compassion of Jesus. And if the person up front said to you, who's the most compassionate person who ever lived, what do you think the answer might be? Jesus! Much better, way better. We're going to act like everybody online thought y'all got it the first time. It's Jesus. It's really hard to read about the life of Jesus or read any historian talk about Jesus. In fact, people who don't even believe that Jesus is the Son of God, one of the reasons that Jesus always comes out as the most influential person in history is people talk about how the compassion of Jesus shaped Western civilization. Then when you begin to think about how the world thinks about human rights and those kind of things, we'll talk about that in a minute, that all of that got shaped by this one man and his immense compassion for the world. And if you haven't done it, I'd encourage you to just read those biographies of Jesus, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And as you read those four accounts of his life, the one thing you'll get for sure is Jesus was for people that no one else was for. He moved toward people that everyone else stood back from. In Mark chapter 5, there's an instance where a demon-possessed guy, he's been cast outside of the city, and he cuts himself, and he hurts himself, and he screams, and he's in deep torment, and nobody wants anything to do with him. They put him way outside and chain him up. And Jesus took a boat trip just to be with him, just to go to him. There's an instance where a leper comes to Jesus and approaches Jesus on his knees. Now again, just imagine that. You're in a crowd, and you approach Jesus on your knees, and the leper says to Jesus, "Make me clean if you're willing." And of course, the reason he added, "if you're willing," is because nobody else was willing. No one else was willing to be close to him. And Jesus said, "I'm willing. Be clean." There's a time where a dad, and all of us who are parents can imagine this, have struggled with their son for so long, and their son lives in this torment of a demon that tosses him back and forth, is the way the scripture describes it. And he can't do anything about it, and the disciples can't do anything about it, and he brings him to Jesus, and Jesus looks at the dad, and he brings the dad and the boy relief because he moves toward them. One of my favorite accounts that I hope we teach in the new year to you, there's a widow, and she's weeping so deeply over the loss that she's felt that there's this real tender verse between her and Jesus where it says, "And the Lord saw her." He saw her. And he said to her, "Don't cry." And that's all it took to restore her loss. But you don't just see Jesus' compassion in the way he healed people that nobody else would have anything to do with. One day a woman's caught in adultery. She's openly a sinner. She's caught in the act of sin. And when everybody else is condemning her and standing against her, Jesus moves to her side. And he stands with her and says, "I don't condemn you either, but hey, don't do this. This isn't what's best for your life. Go, sin no more." There's a little short guy named Zacchaeus who's a tax collector. He's betrayed everybody he knows, and I don't know whether he gets in the tree because if he gets on the ground, everybody will beat him up, or he gets in the tree because he can't see Jesus and he just wants to see Jesus, and Jesus goes over to Zacchaeus and looks up in the tree and says, hey, that's the guy I'm going to have lunch with today, when nobody wants to have anything to do with him. When he tells stories to people about what God's like, because he's the only one that really knows, in fact, what God is like, when he wants them to know what his Father God is like, he says, God's like a father who has a son come to him and say, Dad, I wish you were dead so I could have my inheritance. And the dad says, well, we don't have to wait till we die. I'll just give it all to you right now. And the boy takes it and spends it and shames the dad in the city, and everybody knows about it. And it says that every day the dad stands and looks with compassion for the boy. And when he sees him from far off, he runs to him and he hugs him. And Jesus says, that's what God's like. That's the way God sees you. I mean, you can't look at the life of Jesus without seeing the most compassionate person that any of us are ever going to be around, the most compassionate person that anybody's ever known on the planet. I mean, having compassion on human beings was so much at the core of Jesus' life. He moved toward everybody who had screwed up or messed up or sick or was hurting. This was the high value for Jesus in his life. And I think in our world, when people see it, they think, well, that's because Jesus was one of those squishy, soft guys. He's one of those guys that every time he was around other people, he could just feel all the emotion in people every time they're around him. He's not the kind of guy that was a tough guy to be around. Jesus was the kind of guy people think that if when he stood up to talk, he could see when people disagreed with him and he would massage his teaching, like I can see when I teach and some of y'all don't agree with me. And instead of just saying what he said, people think, oh, Jesus was so compassionate, he could tell people didn't get it, and so he'd just change it. But you can't read the teaching of Jesus and think that's what he did. I mean, Jesus, he taught in such a way, such incredible power. When Jesus has to inflict conflict, when he has to inflict pain on people so that he can be compassionate to them on the other side, he is more than willing to inflict pain. I mean, we see him one time when people are mistreated. Here's what I'll tell you. You should never try to mistreat another human being in Jesus' presence. He is not for that. And he's not this sort of soft guy that'll stand in the corner and go, you shouldn't do that. In fact, Jesus goes to the temple, and it happens, we think, maybe twice. And it says that Jesus spends all day, he sees what's happening in the temple, and he spends all day braiding a whip. He doesn't grab a whip. He doesn't do this in his anger. He spends all day braiding a whip and then walks into the temple and he drives out the money changers. And most people think it's about the money. But I think because of what Jesus says at the end, he's not upset about the money. Jesus is upset about where they are. He says to them, they're in the temple, and they're in the outer court, the court where people like you and me, Gentiles, people who are not Jews, where we were allowed to come. We weren't allowed to go in where the Jewish people were, but we could stand outside. They've taken that court that was intended for us so we could draw near to God, and they made it into a marketplace. And Jesus drives it all out, and he says, you've turned it into a den of robbers, but I intended it to be a house of prayer for all nations. This was for everybody, and you've made it exclusive. The Jesus of the Bible is not some simple, easy teacher who massages his teaching to make everybody happy with what he says. In fact, one time the religious elite comes around and he says, guys, I'm glad you're here today. By the way, I call you snakes. You brood of vipers. How do you think you are going to escape the condemnation of hell? That's not the kind of language that highly sensitive people tend to use. So Jesus, his compassion, it's not some squeamish, highly sensitive, emotional nature that just got bred into him. It comes from a different place. And you know the reason I'm convinced that most people in our world think it comes from that we have to change what we think for the sake of not offending other people, and that's the only way I can have compassion is if somehow I can massage it enough that you and I can move toward each other? is because we're trying to make Jesus in our image. I can't imagine having compassion for people that disagree with me that much. But Jesus' compassion comes from a place that you and I often overlook. Jesus had compassion for every single person because every time he looked at a person, he saw it. That's the image of God. In that one over there, I see the image of God. In that one that's broken and hurting and sinful, in that one that's covered with disease, that one too is the image of God. And Jesus would see a leper or a prostitute or a priest that needed to be shaken a little bit, called a snake. Jesus looked at everyone and he would think, Father, that one too you have crowned with glory and honor, and you have given them dominion over the works of your hand. This person standing before me, as disguised as they are by the mess of this world, this person too is the image of God. Every person Jesus saw, he saw that way. And so Jesus treated every person with great dignity and compassion because he treated them all like they were the son and daughter of a king. Because they are. That's the way he saw them. And most people, especially the poor and the sick and those who were sinners, they were not used to being treated that way. And by the way, they still aren't. Not in our world, not in our culture. And what Jesus saw and modeled for his followers is something that had to be shown because it was from the heart of God throughout the whole Bible. It'd be hard for you to do an honest survey of the whole Bible without seeing that there are 4 categories of people that God says to anybody that really cares about me. If you love me, these 4 categories of people you ought to put on your radar and never forget. These 4 categories God say matter to me, and anybody that doesn't pay attention to me, you're opposing me. When you oppose them, you oppose me. He says the categories are the widows, the orphans, the aliens or people from other countries, and the poor. To oppose them, to stand against them, to not show them compassion, is to oppose me. And of course we get it because in the ancient world there was no social support system. Nobody was going to come help a widow or an orphan or an alien from another country. Nobody was going to move toward the sick. In fact, they just moved away from them. And I'll say in our country, where the social safety net is eroding day by day for the elderly and orphans and aliens and the poor today, people just get used to overlooking. They just get used to not looking and noticing. But God says to his followers, I made them. They are all my sons and daughters, every one of them. So where my people are, where my community is, it is a practice of people in my community to be with those who have no other support, no family, people who don't speak the language, people who have no one that can care for them, for the poor, and you must do something. I've sat around here for ages at Community Christian. When you see a need, you are not called to meet every need. You cannot fix everything in the world. But you can do something. You cannot do everything. But you can. And where you can do something, God asks you to do something. And every time you do something, the world changes just a little bit. And today in the series, Practicing the Way of Jesus, it's time that we take this core value of Jesus and his movement, this generosity of spirit and money and time and emotion and focus, and we put our lives around doing something for those in need in our world.
For the earliest Christians who called themselves followers of the way, they followed Jesus' example. They knew that all people were children of God and cherished by him, so they moved towards those in need with compassion. They couldn't do everything, but they could do something. And this is what historians note over and over again about how this religious movement that believed something as absurd as a man coming back to life survived intense persecution. They didn't have a marketing strategy. They had no political power. By the end of the first century, many were being fed to lions and killed for their belief. Why did their numbers keep growing? Even historians who don't believe in Jesus would claim it was their radical love for the marginalized. The way they saw everyone having immense value and worthy of being loved and served. This was the perfect platform because it was in stark contrast to the Greco-Roman culture of their day. You might remember reading in school about the Greek and Roman gods, Zeus and Poseidon and such. They viewed human beings as toys to use and abuse, so their culture adopted that view of human beings as well. So compassion and generosity was seen as a weak character flaw that should be rooted out. But the church, followers of the way, come along and they hold out this value of Jesus, that every human being, whether or not you're related to them or even know them, has immense worth. Because every human being is made by God in his image. So when you help a child of the King, you are helping the King. And the way they lived and served changed our world to its very core, to the point that 2,000 years later, all of us, whether we believe in Jesus or not, have been affected by it. We would not even talk about human rights were it not for followers of Jesus that believed all humans are made in the image of their Creator. In the ancient world, if you got sick and you had no money, you had no family to care for you, you were toast. But in about 165 AD, there was an epidemic that wiped out between a third and a fourth of the population of the known world. And then about 100 years later, another one wiped out up to a third of the cities in the Roman Empire. We all have lived through a pandemic, so I'm sure we can imagine the panic that would happen in our world if a third of the population or somewhere north of 2 billion people were to die. This was the panic of this ancient world, but there were no systems of compassion set up. What happened to people who were sick was ugly. Historian Thucydides, who wrote a few hundred years before the movement of Jesus, wrote this about a plague in Athens. They died with no one to look after them. Indeed, there were many houses in which all the inhabitants perished through lack of any intention for care. The bodies of the dying were heaped up, one on top of the other. This was the way of their world. And then came the followers of the way. When these pandemics hit the Roman Empire, there was this group of people following a man who would touch lepers, and so, as one writer named Dionysius of Alexandria wrote, heedless of the danger, they took charge of the sick, attending to their every need and ministering to them in Christ. And with them departed this life serenely happy, for they were infected by others with the disease, drawing on themselves the sickness of their neighbors and cheerfully accepting their pains. This movement, with no money, no power, remembered that their leader said, I was hungry, you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you took me in. I was naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I say to you, inasmuch as you did it to the one of the least of these, my brothers, you did it to me. They actually took Jesus seriously and trusted that somehow Jesus is present in the lowliest, most humble, most hurting, and most alone human beings. One of the most famous sermons in that century was by Gregory of Nyssa, and it was to raise money for a place to care for those with leprosy. He said lepers have been made in the image of God. Imagine those words in a world of where lepers were cast out and made to declare themselves unclean around other people. He said lepers have been made in the image of God in the same way you and I have. Let us take care of Christ while there is still time. Let us minister to Christ's needs. Let us give Christ nourishment. Let us clothe Christ. Let us gather Christ in. Let us show Christ honor. And that was the beginning of what would come to be known to the world as hospitals. They decided that every church building should also have a hospice, a place where the sick and the poor can be cared for. That's why even today's hospitals have names, Good Samaritan, or Good Shepherd, or St. Jude's, or St. Elizabeth's. They became the world's first charitable institutions. They became a clear sign of the way of Jesus breaking into the way of this world. And our world has never been the same since.
Those little pieces of ancient history I try to share with you as often as I can, because for followers of Jesus, this is our heritage. You stand in a long line of people that at the cost of their own death, they followed the way. They decided that compassion for other people was more important than what they personally got out of it. They knew it was a part of Jesus. Do you understand that every human being, whether you have any connection with them by race or gender, or whether you have a connection with them because of your country or family relationship, regardless of their intelligence or status or wealth. Every human being has immense, sacred, equal worth and has equal claim to my compassion. That idea that you and I carry deep inside of us, deep enough that people stand in the streets and protest about human rights when they have no clue that the human rights they come from comes from a Jesus they do not believe in. That Jesus is the one that taught us every person, everyone you see, everyone that's different from you, every human being is made in God's image. That is not the way human beings naturally think. And if you doubt it, just turn on the news and watch. Watch what human beings naturally do to each other. This idea came into the world largely through the person of Jesus, and it carries his smell and fingerprints everywhere it goes in our world, through people who for more than 2,000 years have practiced this way of life. They refuse to see a need and say, thoughts and prayers. Instead, they decided that it took me to do something. I can't do everything. But if God can move toward me, for God's sake, I can do something. So much so that even people in our culture have gotten caught up in the movement and they begin to do something, even though we do it in a name that they won't agree with. The practice of doing something about poverty in our world has become so much a part. And it became the part that moved everyone to begin to follow Jesus in our world, to the point that Christianity became the largest religion in our world. Not because people thought, people coming back to life from the grave, that makes perfect sense to me. But because they saw people who so deeply wanted to follow him that they saw resurrection take place in the lives of people who had been addicted and hurt and poor and left by the side, and people loved them back to life. It's really the distinctive of Christianity. Which is why, for Community Christian, for as long as I can remember, long before we ever said to anybody on a t-shirt, you should love everyone always, we would stand before you regularly and we would say, there are needs in our world, and you cannot look at needs and just move on. You must do something, and we collectively will do something together. So I want to tell you a little bit about what we're going to do this year, but I want to remind those of you who haven't been around here for a while that we've been doing this a long time. It's been our pattern that as a church, we would do what we can. We decided early on in the early days of our church that we didn't want to start a lot of things. We didn't want to have a closed closet. We didn't want to have a food bank. We didn't want to be the place where everybody wanted to come to things. Instead, we wanted to say to people in our community who are already trying to do good works, we have something you don't have. I have ready volunteers who will follow Jesus, and they will help you. They will come and help you meet your cause. And if you need money, we will try to support you. So in the early days, we were one of the first. Many of you will remember that we had a Thanksgiving meal that for years we fed thousands of people in our community. And even now people come and say, in fact, I heard a phone call this morning, are you having a Thanksgiving meal? We aren't anymore. And when you want to know why? Well, because we think there are greater needs and other people are now meeting those needs. So we're starting a good news club now so that we can move and work in the community, in schools, so that we can help schools and that we can mentor in schools, because there's so many people in our school that need a stable person, so many little children that need somebody who will come and sit with them and look them in the eye and say, you matter, and I'll be with you, and I will help you. In addition to that, through the years, we've helped people all around our state by giving hundreds of thousands of dollars to start churches like this in communities that didn't have them. Many of you don't know that in Noonan we helped start and provided primary money for Foundation Christian Church. In Griffin we provided money for City Church. In McDonough we helped start Momentum Church there. This year I want to tell you about what we're doing this year as we move forward. You already heard Jason talk about that on the wall as you leave this morning, you'll see these tags that are on the wall. This is our time every year where we get together with Christmas in Coweta, which is a program we don't personally run. It goes through Bridging the Gap, but they provide us with a bunch of names that they've already vetted, families that have needs in our area. And we say to people, Hey, every name on that wall really matters to somebody, and it ought to matter to you. Every name on that wall is a person that's made in the image of God, and we're asking you if you'd grab a tag and take it and buy for that kid. And here's our way of buying for kids at Community Christian. You buy for that kid as if they were your kid. You'll look at that and you'll think, well, I don't know why a poor kid needs all of this. I don't know why my kids need all the crap they ask for either. But I buy for them the way I would buy if they were mine. Because I want to say to them, you matter just as much as mine. And then we say to you, hey, bring them back unwrapped with the tag on the 10th. And the reason we say to you to bring them back unwrapped, and I'll just say this, people haven't understood this forever, is there are a bunch of names on that wall that all belong to the same family. And you take a kid and somebody else takes a kid and you buy one gift for a kid and the other person in the family buys 14,000 gifts for their kid. And then when we're standing with the mom getting ready to wrap, she's put in the position to explain why one kid in her family got one gift. But instead, we ask you to bring them all back in the week, and we take a week to try to balance everything out. So that when we stand with mom or dad on Saturday and we get together and we wrap the gifts, mom gets to look like a hero to her kids because she is. And they get to go home as the one that gets to succeed. And I urge you, if you can't buy, and I'd urge you to come back on Saturday, December the 17th and be here with the parents, where we walk with the parents and we talk to the parents and we look them in the eye and we pray with them at the end of the thing. And we tell them how much they matter to us because they matter to God. So when you're done today, I urge you, if you want to participate in that. In addition to that, every year do something. In the days back when we used to do that, we're starting again this year. I'd say we're asking everybody to give a one-time between now and the end of the year monetary gift. Every dime of this will go outside of this building. None of it goes to us, to some pre-vetted kind of needs that we have that we're trying to make happen here and around the world. Here's what we're doing this year. A few years ago, when the pandemic hit and we began to talk to people and everybody was locked away, and you all know that the rise of anxiety in our culture, one of the things we began to note is, particularly in Coweta County, there aren't enough counselors to handle most of the people, not just in Coweta County, around the country. In fact, if you've tried to get in with a counselor recently, you know that the first available appointment for most counselors is 6 months from today. So we began to pray and think of what we could do about that. And we went and prayed, and I said to Jason, would you be willing to go back to school and become qualified as a licensed counselor? And he agreed to do that. And for those of you who support the church around here regularly over the last few years, you've been paying his tuition for the last few years in that. And he's about a week or two from graduating. Aren't you proud of him? And in just a few weeks, the beginning of the year, we plan to open a counseling center here. We'll just be in the infancy stage. And I just want to say to you, if you're here and you gave money to that, that does not mean you get to come free. It is still an opportunity. We intend to make this a place where it can be self-sustaining over time. We believe if we do it right and charge low enough that everybody can be able to come, and we can make it self-sustaining over time, that we can meet the needs of people, some with scholarships and some with other kind of ways that we will help support. And we believe over time there will be other counselors that will see the good that we do that will want to be a part of it and come in and help people at a reasonable kind of way. But some of the money we raise from what I'm about to tell you about is going to go to provide support for that over the next couple of years before we become self-supporting as a counseling center here in our community. The next thing that we're going to be involved in is, a number of years ago, many of you know, we began an initiative in Haiti to work with communities in Haiti to do community building in Haiti, which means we don't go in like most people do and say, hey, we know the best thing to do for Haiti because we got here about an hour ago. Instead, we go in and we work with people and we listen in the community and we come alongside and do what's best for them that they think is next. We work with an organization called the 410 Bridge. We worked with them in Haiti for the last 12 years, but if you've read anything about the news, you know that
Haiti no longer has a functioning government. And what I mean by that is they haven't had elections since 2018, and gangs now rule that whole country. There's different roaming gangs, and all the organizations have pulled out. And so this organization said to us a few years ago, hey, we'd like to ask all the people who sponsor kids through us in Haiti if they'd be willing to move to Guatemala, and if your church would come help us in Guatemala. And so they moved all of the sponsors. If you sponsored a kid through them, they've moved you to Guatemala. You probably got a notice about that. And a week or so ago, Becky and I went to the community that we're going to be working in Guatemala for the very first time. And it's a great little community called La Nueva de Independencia. In other words, the new independence. And it sits on top of a mountain, about 8,000 feet elevation in the mountains of Guatemala, where they make the best coffee I've ever had in my life. And just a wonderful, I'll tell you this little side thing. We decided while we were there, because he'd moved all the sponsored kids to that community, that the lady who was there with us said, it'd be great if you and Becky would sit down and get all the kids in the school to come over and you could take pictures of the kids back to your sponsors. And so we did. They, one by one, would call these kids out, and they'd come over and they'd sit with the old white man, and they would sit and take pictures. I mean, I'm an old looking, my wife looks exactly like she did when we got married, but I'm old these days. And so we're sitting in these chairs, and one by one, these kids start coming over again and again and again. And eventually, every kid in the school wanted to have their picture taken with us. And we realized one of two things. Either they think we're Santa Claus, or they think we personally are sponsoring everybody in this community. Because at the end of the day, even the adults wanted to have their picture taken with me. But I've already presented some of you who are sponsors with those pictures of your kids. And for those of you who are interested, we'll be announcing trips to that. But some of the money that we'll be raising from this will be going to help with the beginning of the efforts there in that community. The third thing that I'm really happy about for our community is, many of you who've been around Community Christian for a long time know that I've had a heart and wanted to do something for people who are homeless in Coweta County. And for a whole lot of things that happen, our government does not want that to happen. And I could say more, but that isn't going to help me anymore if this tape gets out. They have agreed, because we're now working with a group. Jimmy Ellison's a man at Noonan City Church. He's a pastor there, and a few years ago, without asking anybody, he just began to do something for people in his community, and then he got the Noonan City Council to approve that we can care about homeless people in the city of Noonan if it gets cold enough. If the temperature gets low enough, then we can care. And so I went to a meeting this year where there are 13 churches in Coweta County that work together, which anytime 13 churches will work anything, I'm there, because we normally hate each other. So 13 churches are working together, and I'm sitting listening to the thing, and they're explaining that on Wednesday night, because all the churches in downtown Noonan have Wednesday night programs where their buildings are used, they can't, if it's cold enough on a Wednesday night, they can't house them there, so they load them in buses and put them in hotels for the night. And I said, you know, instead of shipping them to a hotel for the night, Community Christian, you can use our building. I mean, we just open the building up and put cots down, and you can come be in our building on a Wednesday night. And so that's what's going to happen. Now, I say this, and this isn't going anywhere except here and on the internet, but Coweta County doesn't know. Just the city of Noonan, okay? So if it gets cold enough on particular Wednesday nights, we will have a Noonan emergency shelter team here at our building. And some of the money that we'll receive from this will go to help with that. And some of you probably will want to help with that as well as time goes along. Now, I've used up all my time. I'll say this to you. It used to be at this point in these messages would do something that I would say something, and I'd say, now, if you really want to participate in this offering, this is the time that I need everybody to give $39.95. Between now and the end of the year, if I can get a one-time gift for everybody from $39.95, just one time between now and the end of the year, we can fund this whole thing. But because everybody's worried about inflation this year, we've had a rollback. And if you can give me $19.95, between now and the end of the year, and that's not even it. You know, I just want you to think about 1995 for most of the people sitting in the room. That's 50 cents a day between now and the end of the year. It's just 50 cents a day for every person in your family between now and the end of the year. It's less than a cup of coffee. And not even a cup of coffee for like every day, just one cup of coffee. For one day out of the week, you don't drink a cup of coffee and you give it toward this effort. So, some of you should do more. But that's okay. What's the goal for this year? Here's my goal. That all of you give something. If you can't give $19.95, I'm okay. Give $1. But everybody ought to do something. You know why? Because if you're a follower of Jesus, this is the way. This is what we do. We have compassion and we're generous in spirit and heart and money toward those that are in need. And I'll say to you, if you're wondering about it, again, I'll just say, nobody on this church staff, no one in this building is getting any money off of this. Every penny of every dime, no skim off the top, all of it goes outside of this to these projects, none to us. And I'll say to you as an old guy at this point, I have regretted money that I have lost, and I've regretted money that I've invested unwisely. I have never regretted a dime I gave away. Not one. And so I urge you, you participate in this. This is the way of Jesus, who was the most compassionate human being who ever lived and who's called us to follow his way. And before we end, I want you to spend a few moments quiet, and Jason's going to lead us in that.
So we're asking that question, all of us together. What does it look like for us individually to practice that way of Jesus in this area of our lives? How can we partner together to do something for the good of these most vulnerable people in our community and around our world? So in these next few moments of quiet, we're going to just sit, and I want you to just prayerfully consider what next step God might be leading you to do to take care of those in need. So here's how we're going to participate. On the screen right now, you're going to see a QR code. If you take your phone out right now and you scan that QR code, it's going to take you to a website, and you're going to see all the next steps that Ed has already talked about. Some of you who are technologically challenged can't do QR codes. And so if that's you, or if you have trouble with the QR code, all you have to do is go to our website, sharpsburgchurch.com, and you're going to see some feet at the bottom of that website, and that's your next step button. If you click that, you're going to see what I'm talking about. When you get to that website, like I said, you're going to see all the next steps that we've been talking about. First of all, you're going to see a link that gives you the opportunity to give to that those do something projects that Ed just described. It's a secure link. You can know if you give at that link, all the money there goes straight to these projects. We don't see a dime of that. It goes outside of our church. The other link you're going to see on that page is a link to sign up to receive a child for Christmas in Coweta. Now, I know I've already told you to go out in the lobby and get a kid, but I know some of you, y'all want to get to lunch and you ain't got time to read all those kids' names. So, for those of you who are in a hurry and don't want to take the time to do that, all you need to do is click on that link and fill out that form, and then you're going to get a text. And we're going to text you with all the information that you need to sponsor a child. So you can do it that way. If you're new with us today, I understand you may not be comfortable with participating in any of this. And that's okay. But we want to give you an opportunity to take a next step as well. And I've already talked about this in the service. You're also going to see on that side, at that website, you're going to see a link where you can sign up for that 1 hour Next Steps class. That's the place where you can come, meet people in our community, and investigate what it might look like for you to begin to participate in life with us here at Community Christian. And I want to ask you this. When you've done all of those things, when you've considered your next step and you've taken whatever next step God has called you to take, would you do one more thing for me before you leave today in these next few moments of quiet? Would you pray for our church? Would you just ask God to begin to grow our hearts even more in compassion for the vulnerable in our world? Would you ask God to lead us to continue doing something for those in need, that we would be a place that truly does follow the way of Jesus in compassion? And after you've had some time in silence to do all of those things, our band's going to come back and they're going to lead us in singing praise to God for all of His blessings, because He has given us more than we deserve. We have been so blessed, and we need to acknowledge Him for all that He's done for us. And so we're going to sing about that in just a few moments. But before we do, let's follow His example. Let's be generous together.